Montana Territory, 1870. The early summer sun cast long shadows across the valley as 20-year-old Elizabeth Daniels gazed at the sprawling ranch that imprisoned her as surely as any jail cell. Her honey-blonde hair fluttered in the breeze, escaping the tight bun she'd been forced to wear, just as she longed to escape the life her father had planned for her. The pale blue cotton dress she wore, modest and plain as her father demanded, did little to hide her natural beauty, a beauty that had become a curse in Augustus Daniels' eyes. "A woman's only value is what she brings to a business arrangement," he told her repeatedly. "And yours, daughter, is to cement my alliance with Harold Richards." At 55, Harold was a wealthy cattle baron 3 times her age with hands like sandpaper and breath that reeked of whiskey. Elizabeth shuddered at the thought of the impending marriage her father had arranged. In 2 weeks, she would belong to a man whose previous 2 wives had died under circumstances the town doctor had called suspicious but natural. Elizabeth had long since learned that the frontier was no place for dreams, especially a woman's dreams. The harsh Montana Territory crushed softness out of people, leaving only the hard edges behind. Her mother had taught her that before consumption took her 5 years ago. "Hope is a luxury, Lizzie," she'd whispered in her final days. "Survival is all that matters for women out here." Elizabeth believed that truth with every fiber of her being. In this untamed country, a woman's choices were few, and none led to freedom. She could marry as her father ordered, become someone's property, or try to make it alone in a world where lone women were viewed as either prey or fallen. There was no path to true independence. But as Elizabeth stared at the distant mountains, a wild, desperate plan formed in her mind. 20 miles south of the Daniels Ranch, 25-year-old Jacob Foster leaned against the corral fence, watching the new Mustangs he'd captured from the eastern hills. His tanned face was lightly stubbled, his dark hair curling slightly where it met the collar of his worn shirt. 5 years of working other men's land had finally paid off. He'd purchased this small homestead 3 months ago, determined to build something that was truly his. A man needs his own piece of ground. His father had always said before the fever took him during their journey west when Jacob was just 16. Something worth fighting for. Jacob had that now, 200 acres of decent grazing land with a small but sturdy cabin, a good well, and room to grow. What he didn't have was enough hands to work it. A lone cowboy could only do so much, and hiring help required money he didn't have yet. The ranch was everything to Jacob. He'd seen too many men lose themselves to drink, gambling, or the arms of saloon girls. The frontier could swallow a man whole if he didn't have purpose. Love and family were distractions from the brutal work of carving survival from this untamed land. He'd convinced himself that loneliness was simply the price of independence. That belief was tested the very next day when Jacob rode into the small settlement of Pine Creek for supplies. The general store buzzed with activity, unusual for a Tuesday morning. "Heard Augustus Daniels is marrying his daughter off to old man Richards," the shopkeeper told Jacob as he gathered flour and coffee. "Poor girl. That man's meaner than a wounded grizzly, especially with drink in him. Ain't our business how a man runs his family," another rancher commented, though his expression suggested he thought otherwise. Jacob barely registered the conversation until the shop door burst open and a young woman in a pale blue dress entered, her honey-blonde hair partially fallen from its pins, her face flushed with what looked like fear. Their eyes met across the store, and something in her desperate expression made Jacob freeze. Elizabeth hadn't planned to approach a stranger. She'd come to town hoping to speak with the stagecoach driver about Passage East, but her father's foreman had spotted her. She ducked into the general store to avoid him, and now felt trapped. When she saw the young cowboy watching her, something about his steady gaze made her take a chance that would alter both their lives forever. "Sir," she said, approaching Jacob with a confidence she didn't feel. "I understand you're looking for help with your ranch." Jacob blinked in surprise. "I don't believe we've met, miss." "Elizabeth Daniels," she said, extending her hand. "And I heard you mention to Mr. Thompson last week that you needed help with your place." It was a lie. She'd heard no such thing, but the shopkeeper's raised eyebrows suggested she'd guessed correctly. "Not sure what help a young lady like yourself could," Jacob began. "I can cook, clean, tend garden, and I know ranch work," Elizabeth interrupted. "I need employment and a place to stay. Immediately." Before Jacob could respond, the shop door opened again, and a burly man with a weathered face stepped in. Elizabeth tensed visibly. "Miss Elizabeth, your father sent me to fetch you," the man said, his tone suggesting it wasn't a request. Jacob saw the flash of terror in her eyes, and something protective stirred within him. Without thinking through the consequences, he placed himself slightly between Elizabeth and the foreman. "I'm afraid Miss Daniels is discussing business with me," Jacob said, his voice casual but firm. The foreman's eyes narrowed. What business would that be? Elizabeth's next words shocked everyone in the store. "Mr. Foster and I are to be married. I was just discussing the arrangements." A stunned silence fell over the store. Jacob's jaw nearly dropped before he caught himself. The foreman looked suspicious, but also unsure how to proceed. "Your father ain't mentioned no wedding plans," he said finally. "It's quite recent," Elizabeth replied smoothly. "Mr. Foster only proposed yesterday." All eyes turned to Jacob, who found himself at a crossroads. He could expose her lie and send her back to whatever she was running from, or play along with this madness. His instinct for self-preservation warred with something deeper, the unmistakable fear in this woman's eyes. "That's right," Jacob heard himself say. "I've been meaning to speak with Mr. Daniels properly, but Elizabeth accepted my proposal just yesterday." The foreman studied them both suspiciously. "Mr. Daniels will want to discuss this directly. He has other plans for his daughter." "I'd be happy to speak with him," Jacob said, praying his bluff wouldn't be called immediately. "Perhaps you could tell him I'll call tomorrow?" When the foreman finally left, promising that Augustus Daniels would indeed want words, Jacob turned to Elizabeth with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Miss Daniels, would you mind explaining why I've apparently proposed to you?" Elizabeth's composed facade cracked. "My father is forcing me to marry Harold Richards in 2 weeks. The man has buried 2 wives already. I won't be the third." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I need to disappear, and I heard you needed help. I can work, Mr. Foster. I'm not afraid of hard labor." "So this marriage talk was just to throw them off your trail?" Jacob asked, relieved. Elizabeth's eyes widened with a new idea. What if it wasn't? Seeing his alarmed expression, she quickly continued. "Not a real marriage, of course. But if we were to appear married, my father couldn't force his arrangement. Once Richards marries someone else, the danger would pass, and we could go our separate ways." Jacob ran a hand through his hair. "You're suggesting we pretend to be married?" I know it's outrageous," Elizabeth interrupted. "But I'm desperate. You need help with your ranch, and I need to escape my father. It would be a business arrangement, nothing more." The shopkeeper, who had been unsubtle eavesdropping, chimed in. "If you're looking to make it look legitimate, Pastor Wilson's in town today. A real marriage license would be mighty hard for even Augustus Daniels to fight." Jacob stared at them both in disbelief. "You're suggesting we actually get married? To a complete stranger?" "It wouldn't be forever," Elizabeth said quietly. "Once I'm safe, we could seek an annulment or divorce." Jacob should have refused immediately. This was madness, the kind of reckless decision that got men killed on the frontier. Yet something about Elizabeth's quiet determination moved him. And practically speaking, he did need help, and hiring a ranch hand would cost more than he could afford right now. "Your father is going to come after me with a shotgun," Jacob said, already knowing he was going to agree to this insanity. Elizabeth's smile transformed her face. "Not if we're already legally married. Even my father respects the law when it suits him." 6 hours later, Elizabeth Daniels became Elizabeth Foster in a brief ceremony at the small church, with the shopkeeper and his wife as witnesses. The pastor seemed suspicious of the hasty arrangement, but was satisfied when Jacob paid for the license with cash. "I'll have your things sent for," Jacob said as he helped his new wife onto his horse. "There's nothing I want from that house," Elizabeth replied firmly. "Nothing at all." They rode in silence toward Jacob's homestead, the reality of what they'd done settling over them both. For Elizabeth, the relief of escape mingled with fear of the unknown. For Jacob, the bewilderment at finding himself suddenly married was tempered by an odd sense of purpose. "It's not much," Jacob said as his small ranch came into view. The cabin was solid but plain, the corral holding only a handful of horses. "But it's mine. Ours, I suppose, for now." Elizabeth studied what would be her temporary home with genuine interest. "It's a good piece of land, Mr. Foster." "Jacob," he corrected. "If we're to convince people we're married, You should probably use my given name. She nodded, suddenly shy. Jacob. And I'm Elizabeth, though my mother called me Lizzie. Which do you prefer? He asked, helping her down from the horse. The question startled her. No one had asked her preference in years. Lizzie, she said finally. I'd like to be Lizzie again. Then Lizzie it is, Jacob replied with a small smile that transformed his serious face. The awkwardness of their situation became painfully apparent as evening fell. Jacob cleared his throat and addressed the sleeping arrangements. I'll take the barn, he said firmly. The cabin is yours. Elizabeth, Lizzie, looked relieved. This arrangement is temporary, she reminded him, as much for herself as for him. Just until the danger passes. Just business, Jacob agreed, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. That night, as Jacob bedded down in the hay loft, he stared at the rough wood ceiling and wondered what madness had possessed him. He had a ranch to build, cattle to tend, and plans that didn't involve complicated entanglements with a woman running from her powerful father. The frontier was no place for distractions, especially not beautiful, desperate ones with honey-blonde hair and determined eyes. In the cabin, Lizzie lay on the unfamiliar bed, listening to the night sounds of a ranch that wasn't truly hers. She had traded one cage for another, she thought, though this one seemed far less restrictive. She reminded herself this was merely a business arrangement, a stepping stone to true freedom. Attachment to Jacob Foster or his land would be foolish. The frontier had taught her that lesson well. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Both fell asleep believing their alliance was purely practical, neither admitting the spark of something else that had flared when their hands touched during the hasty ceremony. Augustus Daniels arrived the next morning just as Jacob was showing Lizzie how to work the water pump. The rancher came with 4 men, all armed, their expressions grim. Elizabeth, Augustus called, not bothering to dismount. Get your things. This foolishness ends now. Jacob stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Lizzie. Mr. Daniels, I understand this is unexpected, but your daughter and I are legally married. Augustus' face darkened. My daughter is promised to Harold Richards. Whatever game you're playing, boy, it ends now. Elizabeth, come here. Lizzie stepped forward, standing beside Jacob rather than behind him. I'm Mrs. Foster now, Father. The pastor can confirm it. I've already spoken to Pastor Wilson, Augustus snarled. He said the wedding seemed mighty suspicious. Quick marriages can be annulled just as quickly. Not without my consent, Lizzie said, her voice surprisingly steady. Jacob watched the tension between father and daughter with growing concern. Augustus Daniels was a powerful man in the territory, and Jacob was just a small rancher with a mortgage and few allies. Mr. Daniels, Jacob tried again. I understand this has come as a shock, but Lizzie and I... Lizzie, Augustus interrupted, his eyes narrowing. No one calls her that anymore. I do, Jacob said simply, realizing too late this revealed a level of intimacy they were supposed to be pretending. Augustus studied them both, his expression calculating. You expect me to believe you two are in love? That this isn't some scheme to thwart my business arrangements? Whether you believe it or not doesn't change the facts, Jacob replied. We're legally married. Augustus dismounted, approaching them slowly. Elizabeth, you've embarrassed me. Richards is ready to back out of our deal. Good, Lizzie said flatly. You think this scrap of land and this nobody cowboy is your future? Augustus gestured dismissively at Jacob's modest homestead. You'll be back within a month, begging my forgiveness. I won't, Lizzie said, and Jacob heard genuine fear beneath her defiance. Augustus looked at Jacob with cold assessment. You have no idea what you've taken on, boy. My daughter is willful, disobedient. She needs a firm hand. Jacob felt a surge of protective anger. She's my wife now, Mr. Daniels. I'll thank you to remember that. Wife, Augustus scoffed. We'll see how long that lasts. He turned back to Lizzie. When this falls apart, don't come crying to me. You've made your choice. After Augustus and his men rode away, Jacob released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That went better than I expected. I thought he might shoot me on the spot. Lizzie's face was pale. He's not done. My father never concedes defeat so easily. What do you think he'll do? I don't know, she admitted. But he always finds a way to get what he wants. Over the next weeks, Jacob and Lizzie fell into an uneasy routine. She proved herself capable around the ranch, cooking meals that were far better than Jacob's bachelor fare and taking over the vegetable garden with practiced skill. During the days, they worked side by side, mending fences and tending to the small herd Jacob had started. At night, he continued to sleep in the barn while she took the cabin. Their pretense of marriage was maintained whenever they went into town, where they would walk arm in arm, Lizzie wearing the simple gold band Jacob had purchased. The townspeople, initially suspicious of the hasty wedding, gradually accepted them as a couple, especially as they saw how Jacob deferred to Lizzie's opinions and how she spoke of our ranch with growing pride. "You're getting good at pretending," Jacob commented one evening as they rode home from town. Lizzie glanced at him, suddenly self-conscious. "So are you." The truth, which neither was ready to admit, was that less and less pretending was required with each passing day. Jacob found himself watching Lizzie as she worked, admiring not just her beauty but her determination and quick mind. Lizzie discovered that Jacob's quiet strength was different from her father's domineering presence. He listened when she spoke, considered her ideas, and treated her as a partner rather than a possession. One evening, as a sudden storm rolled across the plains, Jacob rushed to secure the horses. Lizzie, seeing a young calf separated from the small herd, ran to guide it to safety. The storm hit with unexpected ferocity, rain pouring in blinding sheets. By the time Jacob had secured the horses, he couldn't see Lizzie anywhere. Panic gripped him as he called her name against the howling wind. Lightning flashed, illuminating the pasture in stark white, and he caught a glimpse of movement near the creek, which would be rising rapidly with the rain. Jacob ran, slipping in the mud, his heart hammering. He found Lizzie struggling to pull the frightened calf away from the creek bank, which was already beginning to crumble under the rush of water. "Leave it," Jacob shouted over the storm, reaching for her. "I can't," she called back, her blonde hair plastered to her face by the rain. "It's just a baby." Before Jacob could argue, the bank gave way. Lizzie and the calf slid toward the churning water. Jacob lunged, catching her arm with one hand and bracing himself against a tree with the other. The calf tumbled into the creek but managed to scramble up the opposite bank, bleeding in terror. "I've got you," Jacob said, pulling Lizzie to safety. They collapsed together on solid ground, breathing hard, the rain still pounding around them. "The calf made it," Lizzie said between gasps, pointing to where the animal had joined its mother. Jacob stared at her in disbelief. "You nearly died for a calf worth $10. "It wasn't about the money," she replied, pushing wet hair from her face. "It was about not leaving the helpless to fend for themselves." Something shifted in Jacob as he looked at this woman, his wife in name only, who risked herself for a frightened calf. The belief that had guided him since his father's death, that the frontier required a hardened heart focused solely on survival, seemed suddenly flawed. "We need to get you warm," he said, helping her to her feet. They stumbled back to the cabin together, soaked through and shivering. Inside, Jacob built up the fire while Lizzie changed behind a screen. When she emerged in a dry dress, her hair still damp, he handed her a cup of coffee laced with a small measure of whiskey. "For the chill," he explained. They sat before the fire in companionable silence until Lizzie spoke. "Why did you agree to this? To marry me, I mean. You didn't know me at all." Jacob considered the question. "You needed help," he said finally. "And I suppose I did too, though I didn't want to admit it." "Is that all?" she asked, watching his face in the firelight. "No," he admitted. "There was something in your eyes when you looked at me in that store. Something that made me think you were worth knowing." The honesty of his answer surprised them both. Lizzie moved closer to him on the bench they shared. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving me. Not just today, but from my father. From Richard's." "You're saving yourself," Jacob replied. "I'm just providing the roof." The storm rattled the windows, and Lizzie unconsciously leaned against his shoulder. Jacob tensed briefly, then relaxed, allowing himself to enjoy the simple human contact he'd denied himself for so long. "When do you think it will be safe?" she asked. "For me to move on, I mean." The question shouldn't have bothered him, but Jacob felt an unexpected pang at the thought of Lizzie leaving. "Hard to say. Your father seems determined. And our arrangement was temporary," she reminded him, though her tone lacked conviction. "Yes," Jacob agreed, staring into the fire. "Temporary." Neither mentioned that temporary was beginning to feel increasingly permanent, and that the thought wasn't entirely unwelcome. The next morning, Jacob woke in his chair by the fire, a blanket draped over him. Lizzie had already started breakfast, humming softly as she worked. The domesticity of the scene struck him with unexpected force. "I need to ride to the north pasture today," he said as they ate. "There's a break in the fence that needs fixing." "I'll come with you," Lizzie offered. "Two pairs of hands will make the work go faster." They rode out together, the land fresh and clean after the storm. As they worked side by side repairing the fence, Jacob found himself telling Lizzie about his plans for the ranch, the cattle he wanted to breed, the addition to the cabin he hoped to build by winter, the orchard he'd started with 5 young apple trees. "You've thought of everything," Lizzie said admiringly. "Not everything," Jacob admitted. "I never thought about sharing it with anyone." "And now?" she asked, her hands stilling on the fence wire. Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. 3 riders crested the hill, and Jacob immediately recognized Harold Richards at the center. "Stay behind me," Jacob said quietly, moving to stand between Lizzie and the approaching men. Richards was a big man with a florid face and cold eyes. He reined his horse to a stop several yards away, studying them both with open contempt. "So this is the husband," Richards said to Lizzie, ignoring Jacob entirely. "This is what you chose over the comfort I could provide." "Mr. Richards," Jacob said evenly. "This is private property." Richards laughed, a harsh sound. "Boy, do you know who I am? I own half this valley." "Not this part of it," Jacob replied, his hand dropping casually to the revolver on his hip. "Elizabeth," Richards addressed her directly, "your father and I have come to an understanding. The offer still stands. This marriage can be dealt with." Lizzie stepped forward to stand beside Jacob. "I'm already married, Mr. Richards." "Legally and willingly." Richards' expression darkened. "Augustus said you might need convincing. Said this was likely just a girlish rebellion." "It's not," Lizzie said firmly. "We'll see," Richards replied. He nodded to his men. "Seems this fence is on disputed property, Foster. My surveyor says this land belongs to me." Jacob's jaw tightened. "That's a lie and you know it. My deed is clear." "Deeds can be challenged," Richards said with a cold smile. "Boundaries can be reinterpreted." "What do you want?" Jacob demanded. "Just to make things difficult for you, boy," Richards replied. "Until Elizabeth comes to her senses." After they rode away, Lizzie turned to Jacob, her face pale. "He's going to try to take your ranch." "Let him try," Jacob said with more confidence than he felt. "My deed is solid." "You don't understand," Lizzie insisted. "Between my father and Richards, they control the bank, the land office, even the sheriff. They can make life impossible for you." "For us," Jacob corrected her. "We're in this together now, remember?" The worry in her eyes cut him deeply. "This is my fault. I've brought this trouble to your door." "No," Jacob said firmly. "You came to me for help, and I agreed. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." That night, as Lizzie prepared for bed, a knock at the door startled them both. Jacob opened it to find the sheriff standing on the porch. "Evening, Foster," Sheriff Miller said, his expression uncomfortable. "Got a complaint about your property line. Richards says you're encroaching on his grazing land." Jacob sighed. "You know that's not true, Sheriff." "I know," Miller agreed. "But Richards wants a formal survey. Until then, he's filed an injunction against you using the north pasture. That's half my grazing land." Jacob protested. "I'm sorry," the sheriff said, and he did look genuinely regretful. "There's a hearing set for next month. Until then, the judge says to maintain the status quo." After the sheriff left, Jacob slammed his fist against the wall in frustration. "Without that pasture, I can't support even my small herd. They're trying to starve us out." Lizzie's eyes filled with determination. "Then we won't let them." The next morning, she rode into town alone, returning with information that changed their strategy entirely. "Richards doesn't actually want your land," she explained to Jacob. "He wants to punish me for refusing him, and you for helping me. But I learned something today. Wilma Peterson at the telegraph office told me Richards is deeply in debt. He's been borrowing against his own properties." "How does that help us?" Jacob asked. "Because his creditors are getting nervous," Lizzie said with growing excitement. "If we can hold out, he might not be able to pursue this vendetta much longer." "Holding out means finding alternative grazing," Jacob pointed out. "What about the West Ridge?" Lizzie suggested. "It's steeper, but there's good grass there." Jacob shook his head. "It's too far from water." "We could dig a catchment," Lizzie persisted. "My father did something similar on our East Range." Jacob studied her thoughtfully. "That might work. It would be a lot of hard labor. I'm not afraid of work, Lizzie reminded him. For the next 3 weeks, they labored from dawn till dusk, digging a series of small catchment ponds on the ridge and driving their cattle to the new grazing area. The work was exhausting, but they fell into a rhythm together, anticipating each other's needs, developing shorthand communications that required few words. In the evenings, exhausted but satisfied with their progress, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, talking about their childhoods, their dreams, the future, though they carefully avoided discussing whether that future would be shared. One night, as they sat side by side on the porch steps, Lizzie asked the question that had been lingering between them. "Do you ever regret our arrangement?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally, "though it's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" she prompted. "A business partnership," he admitted. "A temporary solution to both our problems." And now, Lizzie's voice was barely above a whisper. Jacob turned to look at her, really look at her. The woman who had worked beside him for weeks without complaint, who had shown courage and determination in the face of threats, who had gradually transformed his solitary cabin into a home. "Now I can't imagine this place without you," he said honestly. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Lizzie leaned slightly toward him, and Jacob felt himself drawn to her. Their lips met in a tentative first kiss that quickly deepened into something more significant, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing despite their best efforts to maintain emotional distance. When they finally pulled apart, both looked startled by the intensity of their connection. "This complicates things," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Lizzie agreed, though she didn't move away from him. "But perhaps complications aren't always bad." That night marked a turning point. Though Jacob still slept in the barn out of respect for propriety, their daytime interactions took on a new dimension. Small touches, lingering glances, and shared smiles punctuated their work. The pretense of their marriage began to feel less like a charade and more like a promise in progress. Their fragile happiness was shattered 2 weeks later when a rider brought news that changed everything. Jacob returned from town with a grim expression that immediately set Lizzie on edge. "What is it?" she asked, meeting him at the corral. "Richards is dead," Jacob said without preamble. "Shot himself last night when his creditors came to collect. He was bankrupt, it seems." Lizzie sat down hard on a nearby stump. "Dead? Are you certain?" Jacob nodded. "The whole town's talking about it. Apparently, he'd been gambling away his assets for years. Your father must have known. It explains why he was so desperate to marry you off to Richards. He was trying to save his business partner with your dowry. So it's over?" Lizzie asked, trying to process this unexpected development. "The threat to your ranch, the legal challenges?" "It seems so," Jacob confirmed. "The bank is reclaiming most of Richard's properties to cover his debts." Relief flooded through Lizzie, followed by a wave of uncertainty. Their marriage had been predicated on her need for protection from Richards. With that threat removed, their arrangement had technically reached its conclusion. "I suppose this means our agreement has served its purpose," she said carefully, watching his reaction. Jacob's expression grew guarded. "I suppose it has." An awkward silence fell between them. All the warmth and connection of recent weeks seemed suddenly tenuous, built on a foundation that no longer existed. "What happens now?" Lizzie finally asked. Before Jacob could respond, another rider approached, Augustus Daniels himself, alone this time. Jacob and Lizzie exchanged concerned looks before moving to meet him. Augustus looked older somehow, his face drawn with lines of worry that hadn't been there during their last confrontation. He dismounted slowly, waving away Jacob's instinctively offered hand. "Elizabeth," he acknowledged his daughter with a slight nod. "Foster." "Mr. Daniels," Jacob replied cautiously. "What brings you here?" "You've heard about Richards, I assume?" When they nodded, Augustus continued. "What you may not know is that his debts extend to me as well. We had entanglements." Lizzie's eyes widened. "You're in financial trouble." "Not trouble," Augustus corrected sharply. "Just adjustments required. Which is why I've come." He took a deep breath, as if what he was about to say pained him physically. "I was wrong about Richards. The man was a snake, hiding his gambling from me while borrowing against our joint ventures." The admission clearly cost him pride, and Lizzie stared at her father in shock. Augustus Daniels had never admitted being wrong about anything in her memory. I've come to offer you a proposition, Augustus continued, addressing them both now. I need to consolidate my holdings. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for this land, well above market value, and a position managing one of my better ranches, Foster. You'd have a real future, not this hardscrabble existence. Jacob's expression hardened. This land isn't for sale. Don't be hasty, Augustus warned. This is a generous offer. It's not about the money, Jacob replied firmly. This is my home. Our home, he added, glancing at Lizzie. Augustus turned to his daughter. Elizabeth, be reasonable. This marriage has served its purpose. Richards is gone. You don't need this protection anymore. The moment of truth had arrived. Lizzie looked between her father and Jacob, knowing her next words would determine the course of her life. Father, she said quietly, I'm not coming back with you. Augustus' face darkened. This was a marriage of convenience, nothing more. Don't pretend otherwise. It started that way, Lizzie acknowledged, moving to stand beside Jacob. But things have changed. Changed. Augustus scoffed. In a few weeks? This isn't one of your storybooks, Elizabeth. This is the real world. Yes, it is, she agreed. And in the real world, I found something here I never had at home. Respect. Partnership. She hesitated, then added the word that frightened her most. Love. Jacob's head turned sharply to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. Augustus studied them both with narrowed eyes. Is this true? He demanded of Jacob. Or are you just after her inheritance? Sir, Jacob said evenly. I didn't know Lizzie had any inheritance until this moment. And frankly, I don't care. What I care about is her happiness, her safety, her dreams. Pretty words, Augustus muttered, but some of the fight seemed to leave him. He looked tired suddenly, older than his years. I should have listened to your mother about Richards. She never trusted him. The mention of her mother caught Lizzie off guard. Augustus rarely spoke of his late wife. Mother would have wanted me to be happy, Lizzie said softly. Augustus was silent for a long moment. She would have, he finally agreed. She always said you had her spirit, too much of it for your own good. Is that why you were so determined to break it? Lizzie asked, years of hurt evident in her voice. Her father looked away. I thought I was protecting you. The frontier is no place for softness, Elizabeth. I learned that the hard way. There's a difference between strength and cruelty, Jacob interjected quietly. Your daughter is the strongest person I've ever met. Augustus studied Jacob with new consideration. You actually care for her. I do. Jacob confirmed without hesitation. More than I thought possible. And you, Elizabeth? Augustus asked. Is this truly what you want? Lizzie reached for Jacob's hand, finding it waiting for hers. Yes, she said with certainty. This is exactly what I want. The tension seemed to drain from Augustus' posture. Well then, he said gruffly. I suppose congratulations are in order, belated as they may be. The reconciliation wasn't immediate or complete. Too much history lay between father and daughter for instant forgiveness. But as Augustus prepared to leave, he made one final offer. The north pasture that borders your land. It's actually part of my holdings, not Richard's. I'm willing to sell it to you at a fair price. Consider it a wedding gift. Delayed. After he rode away, Jacob turned to Lizzie, still processing everything that had happened. Did you mean what you said? About love? Lizzie nodded, suddenly shy despite everything they'd been through together. I did. I know our marriage began as an escape, but somewhere along the way, it became my freedom instead. Freedom to choose, to grow, to love. Jacob took both her hands in his. I never believed there was room for love and building a life out here. I thought it was all about survival, about toughness. You've shown me differently. So have you, Lizzie replied. My father taught me that the frontier crushes gentleness. But you've shown me that kindness isn't weakness. It's the greatest strength of all. Jacob pulled her close, his voice rough with emotion. Lizzie Foster, I think we should get married. She laughed, leaning into his embrace. We already are married, remember? Yes, he acknowledged with a smile. But this time, let's do it because we choose each other, not because we're running from something. I choose you, Lizzie whispered. I think I began choosing you the moment you stood beside me in that general store. As the sun set over their land, truly their land now. Jacob and Lizzie sealed their renewed vows with a kiss that promised not just partnership or protection, but a love that would continue to grow with each season. 1 year later, They stood together on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the spring calves frolic in the pasture. Jacob's arm circled Lizzie's waist, resting gently on the curve of her stomach where their first child grew. I used to believe the frontier was no place for dreams, Lizzie mused, leaning against her husband's shoulder. That survival was all we could hope for out here. And now? Jacob asked, his hand gently caressing the new life they had created together. Lizzie smiled up at him, her eyes filled with the peace of a woman who had found her true home. Now I know that dreams aren't luxuries, they're necessities. They're what makes survival worthwhile. Your father's coming for Sunday dinner, Jacob reminded her. The relationship between Augustus and his daughter had slowly mended over the past year, built on new respect and understanding on both sides. He's bringing the rocking chair he made for the baby, Lizzie said. He's determined to be a better grandfather than he was a father. People can change, Jacob observed, thinking of how much they had both transformed since that fateful day in the general store. When they have reason enough. As twilight settled over the Montana Valley, casting long shadows across the land they had fought for and built together, Lizzie and Jacob held each other close, secure in the knowledge that what had begun as a desperate escape had become something far more precious. A love that had not just survived the harsh frontier, but had flourished there, proving that even in the wildest places, the human heart could find its way home.